Welcome to the Secure CIO, the podcast for technology executives who are tasked with hiring and retaining great cybersecurity leaders. Join best-selling author Claire Pales together with industry thought leaders as they answer your questions about sourcing the right leaders, building cybersecurity teams, candidate selection, salaries, skills, and more.
Hello, I'm Claire Pales, and welcome to the Secure CIO podcast. Today's guest is Michelle Price. Michelle is the CEO of AustCyber. She was the inaugural Chief Operating Officer of AustCyber, joining back in 2017, and was appointed the CEO in April of 2018. Prior to joining AustCyber, Michelle had a plethora of senior cybersecurity roles across government, and she was instrumental in the delivery of the government's 2015 cybersecurity review and the 2016 cybersecurity strategy. Michelle is passionate about Australia's cybersecurity sector, enabling all Australian organisations to grow and take advantage of the cyber world. Her full bio is in the show notes, but for now, Michelle, it is great to have you back on the podcast.
It's so good to be here, Claire, and goodness, how much has changed since we were last together for this podcast. A lot.
I know, well, last time we met, it was way back in season 1, and we talked about your journey into cyber. But what's been happening in your world and the world of AustCyber right now?
Well, of course, we've now had a 2020 cybersecurity strategy for the country released by the government. So there's been lots of activity around that. But I think probably more exciting for listeners would be that, the cybersecurity industry has been growing at a rapid rate of knots, in part, of course, because of the pandemic. We can't ignore that. But also because, of course, Australians across the economy are starting to really understand the true value of what cybersecurity has to offer for growth and productivity, but also why it's important at a societal level as well. And so we've gone from, I think at the time we last had a conversation with each other, we were sitting at around about maybe 200 companies that are sovereign Australian cybersecurity companies. We're now well up over 350. There's more than 500 organisations in what we refer to as the cybersecurity sector in the country. And so things have been growing. And I think it's reflective of how much effort is now being placed in the economy around things like digital trust and recognising that digital technologies have such an important role in how we live our lives.
Were you expecting that level of growth? I mean, since we last caught up, did you foresee that this was going to happen in our industry?
We did. In the cybersecurity sector competitiveness plan that AustCyber updates every year, we had projected that we would keep pace with global averages of around about 8% a year as a year-on-year trajectory. What has happened is an estimated growth over the past 12 months of around about 12%. And that's just what we can gather from the available data at the moment. That's reasonably anecdotal, although AustCyber has done a first ever digital census of our sector, which is very exciting, and the results of that will be featured in the 2020 update to the SCP. But we did anticipate it, we just didn't anticipate it was going to be as much as what it has been.
I think trends in our industry can overwhelm us a little bit. I think we just have not expected this type of growth, both from a company perspective and an industry and obviously a threat perspective. And I wanted to have a bit of a focus on one of those topics today that's really been rising in relevance around cybersecurity in today's risk climate, and that's looking at skills. And I know AustCyber look a lot at skills and definitions and understanding where our cybersecurity skills are going to come from now, immediately, but also in the future and in the coming years. One thing that has been rising in relevance is this intersection between cybersecurity, privacy and safety. And, we caught up recently and had a quick chat about this, but you talked about this intersection from a skills perspective and the need for staff who've got capabilities in all these areas. And as our industry grows, it's becoming more and more of a requirement for us to be preempting these skills and capability requirements. Tell me a bit about how you think this intersection and these three sort of types of needs has developed.
Yeah, it's a really interesting area, actually. And I guess we predicted it back in 2016, 2017 at AustCyber, just as AustCyber was starting to form. But the language around it was probably a little bit too far ahead of where the economy's head was at and broader industry understanding of what it means to have that sort of three sort of related fields intersect with each other in the cyber-physical world that we now accept that we are living in. Back in 2017, to say that the phrase cyber-physical meant nothing to anyone except for people in places like government and mostly in sort of Data 61 and different universities, and then, of course, AustCyber. But now, of course, in Australia, as we catch up to lots of other parts of the world around understanding that everything that does have a physical existence will at some point have some sort of impact in the digital world, and definitely vice versa. That it means when we look at the way that we go about our lives, we need to take almost in that subconscious way an account of the security, safety and privacy implications of what we're doing, because data is so intermingled now. We know that digital borders don't really exist in the wild, in the real world. We try to put laws around the way that we manage digital infrastructure and data, and of course they're there for good reason. But it's really, really challenging and complex. And so those underpinning competencies that we need to be able to make decisions on the fly, but be able to trust that the implications of those decisions are as good as they can be, we are seeing significant convergence between the three areas. And I guess the most tangible example that I can give around what we're getting at here is in the Internet of Things. We've now accepted, of course, again, this acceptance piece, we've accepted that a lot of things, physical things that exist that we're using to help make our lives more convenient, more productive, more reliable and more stable, are connected to each other and or the internet. And when we think about the kinds of things that are now driving the production of other things, there is a safety element now. If we get the code wrong in a robot that's sitting in a factory, no matter how large or how small, think about some of how small some of the robots are that are building the chipsets that go into our wearable devices that we have. So it's not even just a mobile phone anymore. Most people have got AirPods or equivalent now that they're wearing, so they can be hands-free while they're walking around. That's actually a safety component is why we're doing that. It's not just about the convenience of it, but the robots that are making the componentry going into those AirPods are tiny robots. If we get any of that wrong, there can be physical ramifications for it. You know, we can have electronic signals going awry in our heads from those AirPods, sending out sort of, electromagnetic waves when they're not supposed to. And of course, the most famous but not relatable to everybody is the pacemaker and how we update software on pacemakers now, and all of those kinds of different things. There's a lot of these things do have a tendency to relate to health, but more and more they're relating to enjoyment and entertainment and convenience. And there's so many other things as well that we can give examples to where we need to be thinking about the safety of how those things behave, but also what happens if something does go wrong with those things. That's what we mean about the safety element, quite apart from the fact that there's also the intangible piece around the judgments that we might make in our behaviours online that can expose us to emotional damage and harm. And those are all of the traditional notions of safety online and how they can have implications in the physical world as well in terms of our personal safety, but also emotional well-being as well. So all of these things are converging now, and it's all happened at a pace that we would never have imagined even 2 years ago as to how quickly that is now happening. And in many ways, we could say that that's the pandemic, but in many ways, it's not. A lot of these things were afoot before the pandemic hit the world. The pandemic's just accelerated, I think, the global consciousness around these things.
It's interesting when you talk about convergence, because I think we've been talking about these converged models of security for a long time. And I think in the traditional sense, how people would normally think about it, they would think about, cyber bringing in fraud and bringing in physical security and travel security and things like that into one team, but not necessarily bringing that into the one person. And so, these very lean teams that need to consider what sort of skills they need in an individual to manage risk and predict risk and prevent risks from being realised. I mean, how do we look at this security problem through a risk lens of one person building that cross-skill capability?
It's a really great question, and it's because it's obviously very, very challenging, particularly for smaller organisations, but even large companies. that are running lean teams, particularly around areas that are new and where you do have, in-house innovation or even outsourced innovation to be able to keep pace with sort of knowledge sharing and knowledge creation. This all goes to the culture of how we develop skills, because a lot of this stuff can't be taught through traditional formal methods, although some of it can, a lot of it can't be. And so we can use all sorts of those kinds of mechanisms that we have through applied learning in the formal education system to encourage our pipeline of skilled people to come into the workforce, whether that's through kids graduating into the workplace, or it's people transitioning from other careers or dying careers in the economy, moving into more technology-driven areas of the economy. But a lot of this is on the job. And that's why I say on life. It is encouraging those kinds of curiosities and those behaviours that really do question and have the, imagination to think through lots and lots and lots of micro scenarios around a different situation.
I think too, just picking up on one of your points there around culture, two things that kind of came to mind was that one is around psychological safety and organisations creating an environment where people feel comfortable enough to be vulnerable to ask what some might consider to be stupid questions, which we all know there are no stupid questions. That environment of the employee community where they can feel comfortable to learn on the job and to ask those questions and to have a focus on new skills. And then the other part of what you said that I thought was interesting was around culture, and that is that so often we focus on beliefs and values and behaviours that are what dictates our culture and what drives cultural activities. But knowledge is such a huge part of people being able to participate in a culture and really understanding the principles that organisations are working to. And if you're a new organisation, or an old one for that matter, that's embarking on these new technologies, sharing knowledge amongst your co-workers and amongst your stakeholders, whether or not they're shareholders or employees, so that everyone's on that same page, so that everybody can be thinking about the risks and the realisation of those risks. I think it's such a complex thing to think about, but actually we've probably got all the tools we need to make sure that we move forward and with that right mindset and that right cultural approach.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. And we can't know what we don't know. That's a fact. But we also can grow the size of the pie if we have the right incentive structures to share. That's also a fact. We've seen that happen time and time again. There's so many different studies out there that demonstrate that in all of the different contexts around diversity of thinking, around diversity of different people and skill sets and experiences in a team. I think what's been missing that perhaps the pandemic has given us a bit of a taste of is how you have that kind of team environment where people are not from the same organisation, and how we trust that the knowledge sharing is going to be for the overall betterment of those people that have come together, as opposed to one or two of them snatching and running. That there's still probably a bit of a way to go around how we allow ourselves to trust that it will be of benefit to all and not just to one or two or a portion of the people that come together to be able to share that knowledge and to grow the knowledge that happens as a result of those people coming together. That is tricky, especially when it comes to the management of risk and dealing with risky situations, because it does introduce in its very nature that activity, that form of knowledge sharing and growing skills is risky against what our backdrop of knowing how we behave as organisations is. And so I'm not saying that any of this stuff is easy, but certainly I think we're demonstrating that, organisations are only going to be able to drive greater profit growth if they become leaner. But I don't think that leaner necessarily means what it used to mean. Leaner usually means you take sort of however much percentage off everything or most things. It comes back to those incentive structures again. So then if we can focus on the ways that we can grow skills through trusted forms of, collaboration and teams coming together in new and different ways, really, that's how we're going to drive greater productivity and value within the economy. Now, I'll say at this juncture that there's a huge number of countries around the world that are far ahead of Australia in this regard. that are already rewarding, their economies are already rewarding companies and organisations in sort of NGO and public sector spaces for collaborating together in ways that previously they just wouldn't have.
And in terms of how we're compared with the other parts of the world, do you feel like Australia's going to catch up, or like are we showing signs that we're moving in the same direction?
I probably spend about half my day in any given day thinking, yes, we are going to catch up, and we'll actually sort of, skip straight up to near the top because we're very good at being able to be innovative, and we're very strong at being inventors. We're also very good at being competitive. So, we love a blood sport. So we'll if there's an incentive there to kind of climb to the top, we'll sort of, do that with a hard-fought win. But the other half of my day is then spent, when I look at sort of the realities of the landscape that Australia finds itself in, the policy and legal systems actually work against us in many ways to be able to tackle this. And so, in the middle there is kind of this overlap where I hear companies, particularly young, innovative companies, and even larger traditional companies that are trying to pivot and or evolve what they're doing and how they do it, kind of get caught in the transaction costs of being able to change and evolve and innovate and get the innovative stuff out into the market in ways that produce value from an economic standpoint. Cyber is a pretty good example of this, where because of the innovation that's required at the same time as the deep tech, at the same time as the go-to-market in a very intermingled, noisy environment, at any given time, I've got half of my companies that are just kind of screaming at me saying, when are we going to solve the system so that we can actually be sovereign? We want to be sovereign. We want to stay in Australia. We want to go global from here. But the system is working really hard against us, and the other half sort of just still trying to make it, So I think that there's lots of little microcosms across the economy that are sort of in that sort of inflection point at the moment, coming off the back of the pandemic, looking at Australia and seeing that, yes, our economic recovery is going to be long and lumpy, but gosh, we've got some things working for us that many other countries don't. But we've also got a lot of systemic issues that are working against us that were in place long before the pandemic hit.
Just on the pandemic, I'm interested to ask you about how you think this is going to affect us, because I'm here in Victoria, and I've got to say that running a business in the last 7 or 8 months in Victoria has been a bit like driving through mud. What are your thoughts? How are organisations going to be able to accelerate out of this pandemic into 2021?
Yeah, I think we're all sort of taking a bit of a pause at the moment. I think that inflection point is going to actually not just be a moment, as the Americans refer to a moment. I think the inflection point is going to give us about 6 months to really understand where we want to head. But a lot of the direction is going to be dictated by industry, not by government. And that's because of how much momentum has actually started already around industries that are applying more and more digital technologies as a means to be able to figure out how you sustain any sort of sense of stability coming out of this, and to regroup and reform around areas that the economy genuinely does have global competitiveness opportunities in. And I think that we are having to make some tough choices at the moment for businesses that are in industries that have been really heavily hit by the pandemic. And we know all of them, hospitality, tourism, but also a range of support services. When I think about the way that the health system has been impacted, particularly the outpatient areas of the hospital system and aged care, these are parts of the economy that have been really significantly hit from a business management point of view. That there are some significant opportunities for more innovative and agile companies to come in and help the mid-tiers in particular, who we need to survive in the economy, to be able to regroup and, I would say, evolve, not pivot. At the same time, we need to help them appreciate what that triangle that we started off talking about in the pod around security, safety, and privacy means for their business. This is a golden opportunity that Australia can use if we are able to do that across the board in as many businesses as possible that should survive the pandemic. To be able to do, then the efficiency and effectiveness gains that we'll have in 12 months' time will be enormous. But necessarily, of course, as JobKeeper comes up for expiration and state and territory government financial help steps in, we're going to actually really have to get a bit edgier, unfortunately, in how we collectively as a society, not as an economy, figure out which businesses do survive. And for those that don't, because they haven't been able to build resilience, particularly in the small business space, for those that haven't been able to figure out ways of being resilient, there's going to be a lot of businesses that have employees that will need to transition. We've got a lot of businesses in the economy, though, that need workers. And so all of the efforts that are going into skilling and reskilling for me needs to be really, really coordinated. And at this point, I'm not confident that we've got that coordination piece happening. It's important to get a lot of money into these kinds of equations, but if that money is not coordinated into the areas that we do have competitiveness in and genuine societal need for, then some of that money will become very inefficient and will push us backwards rather than forwards.
Well, Michelle, I hope to have you back on the podcast in 12 months' time and we can reflect on today's conversation and you can say, what a coordinated effort we were able to bring about and look at how these, converged, highly skilled individuals are sharing their knowledge and gaining new knowledge all the time. And, if we could write ourselves a letter to read in 12 months' time, I hope that we are in such a different place from a social perspective and an environmental perspective and from a commercial perspective. It'd be great to be able to have that conversation. And, I want to thank you for coming back on the podcast today. I always love chatting to you. It's such a fascinating topic to see where cybersecurity in Australia and, in fact, the world is going. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Claire.
Thanks so much for joining me for today's episode. Feel free to listen to some of the previous guests on your favourite podcast app. For more information on all our guests, check out the show notes at thesecurecio.com, where you can also find more information on the Secure CIO framework, grab free chapters of my book, and sign up for my newsletter. If you love the show, please subscribe to the podcast and feel free to leave me a 5-star rating. I'll see you next week.